I appreciate that. We have a terrific panel coming up. I'm very excited about the topics. It's the current status of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. The procedure is, as you all know from the first period, you can put the questions on the behind the table over there in the back, or you can write a question and send it by email, and I will try and see it on the computer. And the only other thing that I want you to know is when I pass a little piece of paper to the speakers, it just tells them that I'm giving them a 2-minute warning. We have today with us three important people who have a lot to say on the issues, and I don't want to take any of their time because they only have 15 minutes each. They're Dalia Fahmy, and she's assistant professor of political science at Long Island University. Maha Azam, chair of Egyptians for Democracy in the United Kingdom. Rachel Scott, an assistant professor of Islamic studies at the Department of Religion and Culture at Virginia Tech. And Muhammad Fadil, associate professor at the Faculty of Law. Their bios are with you. You can read them, and therefore I won't take any more of your time. We can start. Maha? Oh, okay, Dalia. I don't care. Dalia's fine. I have them in different order, but Dalia.
Okay. So as we come upon the third anniversary of the 2011 Egyptian Revolution last week, Saturday, what seemed to be absent from many of the reflections published that day was how the revolution highlighted the role of an inherent need for the rule of law in people's lives. In any country, the rule of law reflects the degree to which the principles and values usually embodied in that state's constitution are applied on the ground. When the people are dissatisfied as a result of poor rule of law, this dissatisfaction implies that the state and the legal institutions fail to meet the people's needs. Consequently, it's the legal institutions that bear the responsibility of promoting and ensuring the implementation of the rule of law. The absence of the rule of law leading to justice was the main reason for the Egyptian Revolution, along with the lack of adherence to democratic principles of freedom of expression, assembly, political participation, and the failure of state institutions and economic stagnations. And what I hope to do today in my talk is talk about the role of the rule of law and democracy, and then discuss their status in Egypt today. Now, with regards to the rule of law, there are two main schools of thought: the instrumental interpretation, the substantive interpretation. According to the instrumental interpretation school, rule of law basically refers to the existence of a legal system in which there are rules, and that these rules are followed. The actual content of the rules is not as important as the actual existence of the rules themselves. In this regard, such rules don't have to be fair or democratic, and therefore a legal system that does not recognize the most basic human rights can still be claimed to be governed by the rule of law. However, under the second approach, the goals are making the state abide by law, ensuring equality before the law, supplying law and order, providing efficient and impartial justice, and upholding human rights. In this regard, a legal system that doesn't respect basic human rights, such as freedom of speech and assembly, can't claim to be governed by the rule of law. According to the United Nations, the rule of law refers to a principle of governance in which all persons and institutions, public and private, including the state itself, are accountable to the laws and are publicly articulated, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated, and which are consistent with international norms of human rights and standards. It requires measures to ensure adherence to the principles of equality before the law, accountability to the law, fairness in application of the law, separation of powers, participation in decision-making, legal certainty, avoidance of arbitrariness, and procedural and legal transparency. That's according to the UN. In this regard, the rule of law articulated in a constitution is a set of rules that ultimately means to promote justice in society. And after that brief discussion of the rule of law, Understanding what it is and what it's meant to accomplish, we can begin to analyze the status of the rule of law and democracy in Egypt and ask ourselves, is the internationally recognized substantive approach being applied here? Are Egypt's constitution and legal and political institutions going to lead to a long-term promotion of justice in society? And in this regard, I want to touch on a few points: the constitution, the role of elections, political participation, and freedom of expression. Now, the constitution, the draft constitution that was completed in early December by a 50-member committee was far from demographically or politically representative. With only 5 women, 4 Copts, and 1 Azhari, the final draft submitted in early December that was put forth for a vote on the referendum about 2 weeks ago that would guarantee the power and autonomy of the military to allow for military trials of civilians. The proposed constitution grants more autonomy to already powerful state institutions, including the military, the judiciary, and the police. The military's leadership is granted the power to approve choices for the defense minister for 2 presidential terms. Military courts are given the power to try civilians, continuing a long-standing practice. A newly formed police council is given the right to approve and reject all laws dealing with the police, effectively given the right to approve or reject those laws and the power to reform itself and then veto that very same reform. In this regard, the 2014 Constitution or the 2013 draft doesn't fully protect the rights and freedom of Egyptians and grants the military a custodial status over the state. In many regards, the Constitution worsens many of the things that have plagued Egypt. State institutions have very little accountability. They haven't provided basic services. There's a high rate of unemployment, deteriorating educational infrastructure, deteriorating infrastructure in general. And since there is no mechanism for the enforcement of rights, rights will remain unprotected. There isn't a balance of power. Balance is tipped in favor of the executive. And when I teach conflict studies, we know that the conflict literature tells us that in post-conflict situations, it's the Constitution where reconciliation is made. It's the Constitution where inclusion is supposed to be guaranteed. The 2012 and 2013 drafts differ in this. The 2012 draft gave more power to the parliament for accountability and to ensure that the population was more represented. In the 2012 Constitution, the parliament was actually given authority over some government composition. On the elections, the interim president, Adli Mansour, is now expected to announce the revised political schedule, calling for presidential elections before the parliamentary elections. This will pave the way for Field Marshal Sisi to step forward as a candidate, and Sisi has yet to confirm, but we all know it's going to happen. The implications of reversing this roadmap, having presidential elections before parliamentary elections, is that if Field Marshal Sisi wins, and he will oversee the implementation of the Constitution, the new draft laws, and crucially the parliamentary elections. It's likely that the Field Marshal will form his own party, he will win the presidency, and then unduly influence the outcome of the parliamentary balloting, where this new party will sweep the parliamentary elections, thus resulting in decreased political participation, a benchmark of democracy and of a political system that is balanced in favor of the executive, with the parliament becoming another rubber stamp to the executive. Now, in terms of political participation, we know that this has decreased over the past couple of years. The government's ongoing crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood intensified in December when authorities designated the group as a terrorist organization, imposing harsh criminal penalties for membership and for participation in political activities. Furthermore, this current constitution explicitly forbids the establishment of political parties on the basis of religion, eliminating the historically most powerful and organized opposition movement and party. However, eliminating such a party from political participation and rendering its members and loyalists as terrorists allows for the political cleansing of Islamists from the state and over time from society. And finally, this has great implications for the media, for media reform, for freedom of expression, and for freedom of assembly, which all indicators have pointed out are decreasing. Through the state of emergency stretching from August to November of last year that were no longer in place in December, the government continued to conduct mass arrests and mass trials for political activists, in which defendants were not afforded the right of due process. The authorities persisted in restricting media outlets in the criticism of the interim government, and on December 29th, police arrested 4 journalists from Al Jazeera English on charges that they aired false news, were broadcasting illegally, and met with a terrorist group, the Muslim Brotherhood. The arrests were part of a broader effort to restrict all media coverage of the Brotherhood's ongoing political protests. And on December 18, security forces raided the office of the Egyptian Center for Economic and Social Rights, confiscated its supplies, arrested several of its staff members, presumably to intimidate other organizations engaging in similar activities. In addition, at the end of the month of December, authorities sentenced 3 key organizers of the 2011 revolution that brought down former President Hosni Mubarak to 3 years prison sentences for peacefully participating in demonstrations against the government. Confrontations between the security forces and protesters occurred on university campuses throughout Egypt during December. The authorities used excessive force, including the shooting death of university students during a demonstration, and defied the border protections of the university grounds for its students by entering campus grounds. What does all of this mean? The partial absence of the rule of law was a central reason for the Egyptian revolution of 2011. The Mubarak regime disregarded the rule of law by amending the constitution to promote the role of the president, issuing laws that served the interests of the president's entourage, allowing for the flourishing of a system of crony capitalism, not enforcing judicial decisions, restricting freedom of speech, and concentrating the power in the hands of the president through the emergency rule. The period following the revolution witnessed an increasing trend toward respecting the rule of law through changes such as enforcement of judicial decisions, trying the former president and his entourage before the courts, increased the promotion of freedom of expression or the perception of. However, this moment was short-lived. The current situation in Egypt today doesn't bode well for democracy. The brilliance of democracy is that it's protected by a constitutional system and the rule of law. And as I mentioned at the start of my talk, the ultimate aim of that is social justice. The Arab Spring of 2011 and the euphoria towards getting to a constitutional democracy that would ultimately lead to social justice has now been replaced, not by the Arab winter, but what I'm calling the Arab polar vortex, that is unfortunately moving Egypt away from democratic norms of social justice and inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organisers for the opportunity to participate in this important conference. I've been given the brief of looking at the issue of human rights, and I'd like to put it in the context of the broader parameters of this conference in terms of the issue that was raised earlier on by Professor Esposito, the question of Islam and democracy, issues to do with military-civil relations and so on. And I'd like to put it to you that in the context of Egypt today, what we're looking at is essentially something that is beyond ideology. It is, in reality, a repressive state that has existed for 60 years and whose legacy, in one form or another, has been one of survival through repressive means, either by the use of the security forces, the judiciary as an aid and an accomplice to its repression, the media as a means of propagating its narrative. And that ultimately what we're seeing today is not perhaps the reality on the ground, which is somewhat polarized in terms of different views and visions of where Egypt should go, but we're even struggling with a step prior to that, and that is the repressive state and its attempt to maintain control over a situation in which it lost control. This is not dissimilar to the military in other parts of the world. And I say not dissimilar because none of them are identical experiences. We have the experience of civil-military relations being played out over a long time in Turkey. the repressive state in Algeria suppressing the Islamist movement, and we're seeing what's happening today in Syria. But what we're seeing in Egypt today is very significant, and I believe the international community can do a lot to try to halt the situation and maybe even reverse it. What we're seeing is an attempt after January 25th to ensure that a democratic process got underway through free and fair elections of parliament and a president. And ultimately, by all accounts, they were free and fair. The process was not perfect, but nevertheless, it was a process, and it was respected by those players that are now being vilified, namely the Islamist party to that struggle for democracy, the Muslim Brotherhood and the FJP, that ultimately played by the rules of the game. And they are now, in a sense, the sacrifice that of Egyptians to their failure to achieve their democracy. The danger with this is that that party that is being vilified is made up not only of the core group of a political party, the FJP, and a large social and political movement, but of many today that are on Egypt's street that were critical of Morsi, that were critical and continue to be increasingly critical even of the Brotherhood, that ultimately want to see an end to military rule. And what they're seeing is the return of that military rule with a vengeance, even if it is going to give itself a civilian facade sometime in the future. The catalogue of abuses is enormous. It's been catalogued very recently by Amnesty International that calls it, in a 40-page publication, the roadmap to repression. Others, such as Human Rights Watch, have also catalogued the abuses. The abuses range from the very upsetting of the democratic process by the kidnapping and detention of Egypt's first freely elected president and his entourage, to the killing of innocent protesters on Egypt's streets through ultimately a shoot-to-kill policy, of arbitrary detention of men, women, and children, and I repeat, children, in Egypt's prison because they carried an emblem that showed the sign of Rab'a, to the clearing of sit-ins such as Rab'a and Nahda in ways that were described earlier on this panel and were described by Human Rights Watch as the worst massacre in modern Egyptian history. The numbers that are put forward in terms of the massacre are only those that are detailed in which there is evidence or forensic evidence of 1,400, but the numbers are reported to be much, much higher than that. Egypt faces a very serious situation, an escalation of human rights abuses as we speak today. There is lack of respect for the rule of law. The idea that a constitution was passed, whatever that constitution, whether it's the constitution of 2012 or 2013, is meaningless if the articles of that constitution are not upheld. And today, the articles of that constitution, whichever constitution, are being openly abused. So I think it's early days before we can talk about constitutions or respect for constitutions. The Arab world over decades has seen elections, has seen the writing of constitutions, but the issue is that the Arab world has lived through dictatorship for a very long time. And what we're seeing in Egypt today is a return to this dictatorship with a vengeance. And the message that's being sent, both domestically, is that democracy doesn't work. And I think beyond Egypt, regionally, again, it is sending a message to a whole generation of young that there must be an alternative way. It is worrying what that alternative way may be. There is the whole issue of radicalization that we've lived through in the decades past, and the best cure for that was the emergence of moderate Islamist parties that pulled the rug from underneath those that spoke of a radical Islamist alternative. That is being seriously challenged today. And I don't posit it as a threat. I posit it as a fear that many have within Egyptian society and beyond, among the people themselves that are out on the streets and have opted for peaceful protest, for a non-violent alternative. Those very individuals fear that at the margins of the protests, that at the margins of their generation, there will be an increasing call for alternatives that are violent. So the human rights abuses have very serious implications. They have serious implications because, in a sense, they are the means by which the state today and its various apparatuses are seeking control. If two of the principal aspects of democratic change are participation and accountability, the Egyptian regime today is ensuring that there is no participation by alternative political voices, be they the Brotherhood or any other group. And they are also ensuring that they are not held accountable, and this is key. From now on, the military and the police and the judiciary are saying to the majority, to the Egyptians as a whole, to the Egyptian public, you will not hold us accountable. And essentially for the outside world that's looking on, this regime that they have been willing to give a chance to in order to pursue a so-called roadmap because of the numbers that are again questionable that came out on the 30th of June, has not abided by its so-called commitment to a roadmap towards democracy. And in that sense, the international community needs to withdraw its support. This is its cue. It has looked on now for 7 months, in which there has been a consistent escalation of human rights violations in Egypt that don't seem to be diminishing at any time soon, but on the contrary, as the protests continue throughout Egypt, whether on a small scale or on a large scale, journalists who speak out, the young who come out on a daily basis do not have their rights respected at any level. They're picked up, they are in some cases tortured, they are detained without trial or access to lawyers or family. The picture is very, very grim. And the referendum, as we heard earlier from Michel Dunn, whatever the numbers, in reality, there wasn't a no campaign allowed by those that wanted to carry out a no campaign. So there is no room in Egypt for an alternative view. Given that situation, the present military regime has not abided by international norms, by bringing down an elected president and upsetting a political process through a military coup. But its second mistake is that it has actually continued to abuse its power in a very serious way. And it has let down its supporters, whether in the United States or the European Union, on a daily basis by abusing human rights. It doesn't offer stability. The economic situation in Egypt is deteriorating on a daily basis. The money promised by the Gulf is not going to help a nation of 90 million recover. The security in the Sinai Peninsula is increasingly volatile. And we are seeing acts of violence taking place against the security forces in different parts of Egypt. The prospect of civil strife is increasing as the military and those who support it play on the division between two nations in Egypt, two peoples. Songs are sung about, you are one people and we are another people. The narrative of sectarianism is rife. When churches are burnt in Egypt, those who are held, no one is held accountable for them. The security service stand aside and watch it happen. Ultimately, the state is playing havoc not only with the Muslim Brotherhood and the general public in Egypt and voices of dissent, it's also using the Copts and sectarianism as a means to achieve its own end. The business elite in Egypt has suffered over the last years and months by holding out and hoping that somehow they can re-establish the years of Mubarak and the corrupt ways of an oligarchy that has done very well for itself. But ultimately it has suffered from not supporting a democratic process. In any democracy, there is going to be accountability of all groups. There is going to be a need to pay taxation. There is going to be a need to respect the rule of law. And until those that support the present system and have supported it for the last 30 years come to accept that ultimately there needs to be reform of that system, there is very little that any government can do. I put it to you that the issue and the challenges that President Morsi faced were not those to do with his Islamist background, that any reformer that would have taken the reins of power in Egypt and achieved success through the democratic process, but then had turned to seek some kind of gradual reform, or, by contrast, revolutionary and much more direct reform, was going to face a very serious challenge from the military and from the institutions of state that were reluctant to see any change. The future trajectory of Egypt is such that this is a long struggle. It is a long struggle for some serious change in that society. But ultimately, there is a generation in Egypt that's not going to take this lying down. They're willing to bring about this change, even if it's going to cost them their lives, because they know that the alternative is one in which they return to a dictatorial system which they challenged 3 years ago. There is an onus on the international community to put very serious diplomatic and political pressure on the regime in Egypt through censorship, through censoring it in international bodies such as the United Nations Human Rights Council, to ensure that there are legal measures taken against those that have committed crimes against innocent people and unarmed protesters, through ensuring that they do not get travel visas and enter the democratic countries of the West. There is much to be done. In the same way that there is a catalogue of abuses, there is also means with which to stand up against those that perpetrate those abuses, by ensuring that, for example, arms sales to these countries that are used against the protesters are stopped. And there are countries in Europe, such as the United Kingdom and others, that have resumed arms sales. So the onus is on the people of Egypt to continue their struggle. But there is a sense of responsibility, I think, and this goes beyond an academic discussion today. There is an onus on the international community and academics and others to see what is happening in Egypt as a threat to stability in that country, to regional stability, and to all fragile democracies. The message that's being sent out is that repression and strong-arm tactics by military men can succeed, and there needs to be a very strong and willful response to that. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm going to be talking about, well, international law and the consequences of the coup. Now, from an international law perspective, two bodies of law might be considered relevant to the events, to what's going on in Egypt. The first is international humanitarian law, and the second is international human rights law. These are two distinct bodies of law. One, the international humanitarian law, applies to armed conflicts, whether international or internal, and the second, international human rights law, applies in non-conflict situations. Now, despite the rhetoric of the Egyptian government, I don't think what is going on in Egypt, in fact, does qualify as an internal conflict. And so accordingly, I'm focusing on international human rights law and its relationship to the Treaty of Rome, the Statute of Rome that created the International Criminal Court. Let's see if that works. Okay. So the relevant substantive crime, which I think is at issue in the wake of the coup, is crimes against humanity. So the International Criminal Court does have jurisdiction, at least provisionally speaking, we can talk about the details later, to prosecute crimes against humanity. And there's a laundry list of acts that qualify as a crime against humanity. But the important thing, in addition to the act itself, is that it has to be part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge. So it has to be widespread, systematic, and there has to be knowledge that it's going on. Now, what are the specific acts that, with those prior conditions, rise to crimes against humanity? Murder. I think that could be alleged in Egypt. E, imprisonment or other severe deprivation of physical liberty in violation of fundamental rules of international law. I think, as my colleagues have mentioned in previous presentations, there's been mass arrests that would probably do the trick. Torture, although torture right now we don't have the visual evidence of systematic and widespread torture, I think if people had access to the detainees, that evidence would probably turn up. And then finally, there's this last category, well, not finally, but then, oh, I keep forgetting to switch, sorry. H, persecution against any identifiable group or collectivity on political or religious grounds. Now, it's interesting that the persecution of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is actually being pursued on both grounds. First, they're being accused of being terrorists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're actually being accused of being a kind of religious cult, heretical Muslims, et cetera, and should be persecuted on those grounds as well because they are not true Muslims. So again, I think there's a prima facie case that element is also being satisfied. By the way, you can be prosecuted for any one of these. You don't need to have all of them, right? And then there's some others. Enforced disappearance of persons. There are several very well-known cases of Egyptians who have just been disappeared since the coup, including former advisors to the former president, including one who was a graduate of the University of Toronto, where I teach, and he hasn't been heard from in 6 months, and he hasn't been charged with any crime, right? And then I'm sure we could, with the proper investigation, we could find other cases as well. And then finally, other inhumane acts of similar character intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental or physical health, right? Any of these acts on their own, and certainly in combination, if done on a widespread or systematic basis, rise to the level of a crime against humanity. Now, the treaty also provides us with some interpretive provisions. So as for what an attack means, it means a course of conduct involving the multiple commission of acts referred to in paragraph 1 against any civilian population, pursuant to or in furtherance of a state or organizational policy to commit such attack. Now, the clearest evidence or the clearest instance of a course of conduct pursuant to or in furtherance of a state policy, of course, was how the state cleared the sit-ins at Rab'a and Nahda. The sit-in had gone on for approximately 6 weeks. The cabinet met several times. Warnings were issued. Clearly, the police and the military acted at the direction of the government. Right? This is, I think, would not be very hard to satisfy this standard in the ICC. I will skip through torture because I think I'm probably running out of time. Persecution means the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights contrary to international law by reason of the identity of the group or collectivity. Clearly, here in Egypt, people who are either members of the Muslim Brotherhood or accused of being members of the Muslim Brotherhood are being deprived of fundamental rights, namely just the basic right of life, of liberty, to participate in the collective governance of their society. So again, I think there's little doubt that what the Egyptian government is doing would qualify as persecution under the Statute of Rome. Again, I'm going to skip what it says about enforced disappearance. Well, the second question is, once you establish the existence of a substantive crime, or at least a prima facie case, then there's the question of establishing individual criminal responsibility. That's set out in Article 25 of the statute. Here, the important section is sub 3. A person shall be criminally responsible and liable for punishment for a crime against humanity if that person commits such a crime, whether as an individual, jointly with another, or through another person, regardless of whether that person is criminally responsible, right? So basically what this is just saying is that you don't actually have to pull the trigger yourself to be guilty of the crime against humanity, right? So senior leadership of the Egyptian government, not just Sisi, not just the Ministry of Interior, but also the entire cabinet that voted, apparently, to allow the Minister of Interior and the army to do this, they would also be culpable, potentially culpable under Article 25, right? And again, the treaty provides several grounds for liability, right? And it's actually quite broad, right? So you can be a direct perpetrator, an indirect perpetrator, you could be a direct co-perpetrator, indirect co-perpetrator. In any case, I think that with proper investigation, and a lot of the facts have already been documented because the massacre was so public, it would be quite easy to imagine very senior members of the Egyptian government to be indictable before the ICC. Now, and the reason why I'm very confident of this is if one looks at the facts that were alleged in the recent indictment of Muammar al-Qaddafi, his son, and their military intelligence chief, Abdullah Sanusi. In the indictment, the attacks that were covered the period beginning with February 15th for the two elements of murder and persecution. That's the only thing that the prosecution alleged against them. And it spoke specifically about attacks that occurred beginning in February 15th onwards, with the express purpose to quell the February 2011 popular demonstrations by all means and pursuant to state policy. Again, here I think if we do an analogy, the violence that was directed against the sit-in protesters at Rabaa was part of a state policy because the government made a decision to do so. And it was in furtherance of a political goal, namely to crush this political protest movement. Now, if you go through the 40-page indictment, which is available on the internet, and you can find it easily on the ICC website, there are lots of interesting facts which are analogous to the situation in Egypt. The legal system criminalized propaganda against the regime and demonstrating against the government. Everybody knows about the infamous protest law that has since been adopted, whereby you have no right to protest or even get together with 10 people or more without the prior permission of the Ministry of Interior. And if you violate that, you'll be subject to massive fines and jail time, if not worse. In Libya, according to the indictment, the government incited people against dissidents, arresting them, members of their families, and sometimes disappearing them entirely. I think, according to the reports gathered by human rights groups, this is going on routinely in Egypt. And then, interestingly, the government launched a campaign to cover up crimes by targeting journalists. Again, this is what's going on in Egypt. Just today, the head of the Al Jazeera English, who happens to be a Canadian of Egyptian extraction, his team is now formally indicted for giving aid to a terrorist organization, and they're going to face trial. Right? So again, here we see a coarse and systematic conduct by the government targeting journalists in order to cover up evidence of what's going on. Again, I don't know how much time. Okay, so if we just look at the numbers of deaths, again, I take it that Egypt is a larger country than Libya, but nevertheless, if you look at the numbers of people killed in the indictment against Qaddafi and his son and the military intelligence chief, it was hundreds of civilians. We already know that at least 1,600 have been killed in Egypt, probably more, and scores maimed, many people left burned and stacked like wood in morgues. And again, the indictment points out that these attacks were systematic, right? They weren't random acts by out-of-control, low-level police or military. Okay. And so these facts together supported the indictment of murder and persecution. Now, I don't want to go into all the details in law for all the different theories for establishing individual liability, but the case law of the ICC has certainly established these four different theories: direct participation, you pulled the trigger, or indirect participation by controlling the forces that did it. And in Egypt, again, you have a disciplined military, the military being the most disciplined group in Egypt, right? So it's hard to believe that they would allege that the soldiers were acting on their own. They acted, followed orders. Likewise, the same must be the case with the police. In any case, it would be very easy to show that in court, right? So these are the factors that they look at. The suspect controls the organization. The Minister of Defense oversees the army. The Minister of Interior oversees the police, right? And we can rely on virtually automatic compliance by the people in those organizations. Okay, now I want to just go quickly to my the last slide, because I think I'm running out of time. How much time do I have? 1 minute? 2. Okay. Now, the Rabaa massacre was only the most prominent of a series of post-coup massacres, like I said, that certainly would satisfy the requirement of a widespread and systematic attacks against civilian population, right? And there's little doubt that this policy has been approved by the most senior levels of the Egyptian government, right? It's inconceivable that the police or the military acted on their own, for example, in clearing the square. Now, what about the likelihood of prosecution and the consequences for democratization? Egypt is not a party to the Statute of Rome, and so under international law, the ICC does not have jurisdiction over events in Egypt, right? Now, there's another way that it could get jurisdiction, and that's if the Security Council referred Egypt to the International Criminal Court, as occurred in the case of Libya. That, again, I think is highly unlikely, right, for lots of reasons, mainly Syria. Syria is much worse, but there's been a great reluctance to refer Syria to the ICC because of the political issues involved. So we can pretty much make a safe bet that the Security Council is not going to intervene in Egypt. Okay. But that does not mean that the government is home free. This is the problem that I think people are underestimating and don't realize what a catastrophe it is if you're concerned at all about future democratization in the country. I don't think, whatever we think of the morality of what happened, we can't say that these people are stupid or that they are unable to understand where their individual interests lie. General Sisi certainly knows, as the rest of the Egyptian military knows with certainty, that they could, in theory, be prosecuted for these actions. So too the Ministry of Interior, right? So that will make them extremely unlikely to give up any kind of meaningful power to any civilian government, because any civilian government in the future could very well submit to the Treaty of Rome, right? And this is the dilemma, okay? It's not simply that, oh yeah, Egypt is home free because it's not a party to the treaty. It's only true if it stays out of the jurisdiction of the treaty. And the only way to guarantee that is for the military to maintain control for the foreseeable future until this generation or this group of people who are potentially indictable die, right? And so that leaves me with a very pessimistic conclusion, that there is no way that the current leadership of Egypt will ever risk any meaningful democracy because their necks are literally on the line. And then finally, one last observation, there are the political consequences. Even aside from the criminal possibility of criminal prosecution for the individuals who are involved in the decisions to pursue the security crackdown. What happens to a country when its leadership becomes under the cloud of prosecution for crimes against humanity? Those countries do not prosper. They become international pariahs. It may not be the case that the United States or the EU is acting as as acting as proactively as some of us might like. But I don't think that countries that engage in this kind of behavior, Syria in the 80s, Algeria in the 90s, have found that that's a path forward. Actually creates more insularity, more backwardsness, and unfortunately that's the road that Egypt appears to be taking. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to speak today. Okay, so the question of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in relation to Egypt's Christians has often been analyzed through the lens of the Islamist, secularist, or religious versus civil binary. The common assumption is that democracy, human rights, and the rule of law can only be achieved within a secular state, and that Christians would, of course, want a secular, or as more often stated in the Egyptian context, a civil state. Similarly, violence between Christians and Muslims is most often attributed to religious differences, differences that will, it is argued, result in more animosity under a, quote, Islamist regime. Such discourses often do not define the secular, civil, Islamist, or religious that is operative in the binary, and such discourses not only obfuscate, but also justify considerable violence in themselves. In addition, the religious difference of Coptic Christians is often not put into a broader context that considers the multiplicity of positions taken by Copts, positions that relate to broader questions about Egyptian society, culture, and the power of the Egyptian state. This presentation addresses two connected issues that relate to the Egyptian Coptic Christian community's role in the Egyptian revolution and before and after Morsi's ouster. The two questions are, one, the extent to which the neo-millet partnership in which the church has been the political representative of the Copts is being replaced by the representation of lay groups, and two, connected to this, how Christians have been involved in the amendment of Egypt's constitution with particular reference to Article 3. These two issues situate Christians within the complexity of the Egyptian political environment, avoid looking at Christians as a monolithic bloc through the lens of religious persecution and difference, and complicate the secular religious binary. Under the leadership of Pope Shenouda III, the Coptic Church emerged as the effective political representative of Coptic concerns. Like his predecessor, Pope Shenouda based his relations from 1985 on with President Mubarak on what has been termed the neo-millet partnership. This involved the Pope presenting the concerns of the community to the President in return for promoting Coptic loyalty to the regime. In 2003, the Pope Shenouda stated that, quote, the state can deal with one person and reach a result, rather than dealing with millions of persons, especially when it knows that those millions will listen to the word of the Pope. Demonstrations by Copts mostly took place at the behest of the clergy and within the confines of church walls. The church pursued a policy of discouraging grassroots Coptic activists from independently applying pressure on the regime, even to the point of suspending politically active priests. This situation was both contingent upon and reinforced Mubarak's authoritarian regime. The Mubarak regime used the issue of sectarian violence to bolster its iron fist policy. The argument was, and was repeatedly voiced by many Copts, that the Mubarak regime was better than the alternative, the Muslim Brotherhood. However, many secular Copts rejected this neo-millet form of part representation, seeing it as a violation of the principle of citizenship and a reinforcement of the idea of Copts as a religious minority. Shortly before the 2011 revolution, there were signs that some Copts had become breaking away from being represented politically by the Pope. The Catholic Copt George Ishaq was a key organizer of Kefaya, which also provided the training ground for the Coptic activist Hani Jaziri, who in 2009 started the Copts for Egypt movement. In February 2010, this group led what Jaziri claims to be the first Coptic protest outside the walls of the church. However, it was the attack on the Al-Qadasine church in Alexandria in January 2011 that led to a stronger breakaway from the authority of the church. The attack precipitated a suspicion that the Mubarak regime held ulterior motives in either fomenting sectarian violence or in doing little to stop it. Many in the community disapproved of the church's weak stance in response to the bombing, which included blaming the attack on outside forces seeking to destabilize the country. After the bombing, activists in Copts for Egypt, alongside independent Coptic demonstrators, chanted anti-Mubarak slogans in Cairo and Alexandria, while the Pope spoke out publicly against them. During the revolution of 2011, Pope Shenouda and the Church spoke out against the uprising, although many bishops and young activists said that the status quo was unacceptable. Paul Rowe argues that since the revolution of 2011, there has been an erosion of this neo-Millet partnership in favor of a Republican and pluralist model of citizenship in which individual Copts represent their own interests. One of the example of this is the Massborough Youth Union that was formed in the summer of 2011. And the group itself has taken a deliberate stance as a rival to the political representation offered by the Coptic Orthodox Church. For example, refusing to agree to the pressure of the Pope to negotiate on their behalf with SCAF and insisting that they would negotiate with SCAF themselves. Rowe argues that the increasingly assertive public role of lay movements among Copts, coupled with the death of Pope Shenouda in early 2012 and his replacement by Pope Tawadros II the following November, all point to the continued erosion of the elite partnership in favour of the new model, and initial conjecture was that the new Pope would eschew a political role for the patriarchy. However, the growth in lay activism has been accompanied by a reassertion of the neo-Millet model. It is true that with Mohamed Morsi as president, Tawadros departed from the actions of his predecessor in undertaking public criticism of Egypt's leadership and not supporting those in power. However, by intervening in politics in the months leading up to Morsi's ouster, he effectively continued to be seen by many as representing the Copts. Tawadros was a firm critic of the Constitution of 2012, which was vilified on account of the content and the process by which it was put together. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's announcement that President Morsi had been removed from power was supported by Pope Tawadros II and the Sheikh of Al-Azhar. This act in itself was a replication of the neo-Millet partnership model, albeit in a revised form, whereby the Pope, in endorsing the coup, was seen to give the entire Coptic community support. Sisi had also announced the suspension of the Constitution of 2012. The Constitution of 2012 had been systematically delegitimized through the secular versus Islamist and civil versus religious binary, in which the Islamist nature of the Constitution was posited as being in complete opposition to notions of human rights. The delegitimization of the Constitution played an extremely important role in justifying the coup of 2013. These assumptions need close analysis and unpacking and problematization, along with an analysis of how the Constitution fares in comparison with previous ones and its subsequent one. One of the articles that was systematically criticized, particularly in the Western press, as being against the rights of religious minorities was Article 3 of the Constitution that stated that, quote, the principles of Christian and Jewish laws are the main source of legislation for followers of Christianity and Judaism in matters pertaining to personal status, religious affairs, and the nomination of religious leaders. In addition, Article 43 read, freedom of belief is an inviolable right. The state shall guarantee the freedom to practice religious rights and to establish places of worship for the divine religions as regulated by law. Both articles constitutionally enshrine the principle of the divinely revealed religions as a key part of the relationship between religion and state. However, specific limitations on the rights of religions that are not seen as divinely revealed would only come into effect with the passing of particular laws limiting those that might limit those rights. Despite coverage that the Constitution in general on Article 3 in particular was against the rights of religious minorities, in its memorandum released in late July 2013, the Coptic Orthodox Church was more concerned with Article 219, which it argued installs a strict code of Islam. It asserted that Article 2 should remain in the Constitution, but it requested amendments to Article 4. The Coptic Orthodox Church, however, did not seek to abolish Article 3, and Bishop Bola, the Church's representative on the Constitutional Amendment Committee, requested that it remain. While there are some questions as to whether it should be amended to include Jews, Christians, and non-Muslims, and this question is a complex issue, it is a complex issue of what church representative took or what position the churches took and at what time, while also contending with the positions of Al-Azhar and the Salafi parties on this question. There is evidence that the Coptic churches did not strongly demand the addition of non-Muslims and certainly did not support the article's abolition. In addition, the only amendment to Article 43 that was requested did not do away with the concept of the divinely revealed religions, but simply stated that freedom of belief is absolute as opposed to guaranteed. Such a position is perhaps difficult to understand given the rhetoric of secularism versus Islamism that accompanied coverage of the coup. However, it is less difficult to understand if one sees the maintenance of Article 3 as relating to enforcing the current situation in which Egyptian society is made up of religious communities as opposed to self-governing religiously unaffiliated individuals. The article indirectly leads to the restriction of citizens' rights to marry and divorce, since it makes them subject to canon law and church decrees. The maintenance of separate personal status law reinforces Copts as Christians and reinforces religious difference, and thus reinforces the control of the church over the Coptic community. So in this sense, the maintenance of Article 3 can be seen to be given more power to the church and therefore to support this neo-millet partnership. This is clear when one reflects on the reasons Bishop Jeremiah, head of the Coptic Orthodox Cultural Center in Cairo, gave for resisting the insertion of non-Muslims into Article 3. He said such an insertion, quote, would hurt both Muslims and Christians, since Christians would not be protected from the requests of Jehovah's Witnesses and other denominations that are not recognized by the 3 Coptic churches. The only way to ensure the interests of the nation, he argued, is to tighten religious liberties. While Bishop Jeremiah represents one end of the spectrum, not only within the Coptic community as a whole, but also within the church, these concerns are shared by a number within the Orthodox Church. The Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies stated that this multiple parallel legal system constitutes a sharp departure from the norm of modern nation states. Certainly it is against liberal notions of individual human rights, yet its maintenance in the new constitution suggests that understanding ideological battles regarding the future of state and society in Egypt through the Islamist secularist binary, which posits the Muslim Brotherhood against others, is less than useful. The Church's position on Article 3 was rejected by the Massborough Youth Union. The organization called for a, quote, civil state and for the removal of Article 3 and indeed Article 2. The union criticized the absence of Coptic civil representation in the new Constitutional Assembly. A new movement called Saha calls for the church to be involved in spiritual issues only and for politics to be left to politics. Despite the existence of such movements, what is interesting is that in the Constituent Amendment Committee of 50, which privileged state institutions, the Copts, in the sense of groups specifically identified as Copt, were given 3 places, and those places were taken up by the 3 Coptic churches. It seems that a large number of Copts accepted that clergymen were to be representative of Copts in the Constituent Assembly. For example, a number of Coptic movements, such as Copts Without Restrictions, which belongs to the broader umbrella Coptic Council, stated that the representation of the church in the Constituent Assembly should not be considered as intervention of religion in politics, but rather that the church has the right to be represented in the Constituent Assembly. Interesting to note here is that there is also a group, albeit a small one, called the 38 Copts Association that demands that as Egyptians, Copts should be constitutionally subject to Islamic law, which allows for divorce. To conclude, the question remains as to whether the current authoritarian military regime will lead to the kind of neo-millet partnership that was seen under Pope Shenouda. There is a strong possibility that it might. However, at the same time, it is clear that there is no return in the full sense of the word, and that the revolution did unleash Coptic forces that were intent on resisting the church, representing them politically. In addition, the Coptic community's stance vis-à-vis the constitution illustrates that seeing the group as a monolithic bloc with its similar goals is mistaken. Language that pits civil parties, religious minorities, and the secular against Islamists and the religious is not simply distorting. Such language was used to justify the suspension of the constitution and the atrocities committed in the coup. Such a binary polarized and gave an ideological veneer and justification to a coup that was propelled by other motivations, at least as far as the Egyptian military was concerned. Thank you.